الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we talk about how the Quran mentions women from the beginning to the end. Some examples, we cannot really go over every verse that has the mention of women in it, whether it's rulings, whether it's figures that are mentioned, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to mention in the Quran that changed the world, as we heard that we will hear inshallah ta'ala, and things to admonish our hearts, relationships, rights to be observed, and one of which is in Surah An-Nisa, which mentions in it many of the ahkam, the rulings, the rights to be observed. And when we see how humanity and how the human beings, they used to oppress women, and it's just the nature of the human beings. Whenever someone has power, they would tend to oppress those who are weak, if they're not just, if they're not fair. Unless people would be righteous and obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is where the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the creator of everyone, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and He's the most just and He's the most merciful. And the rulings in the book of Allah, it does not come into the favor of one or the other, but rather to bring about goodness and justice and mercy by the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for people to be able to live a life that is supposed to fulfill their purpose, which is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So whoever really study the deen of Islam and study the Quran, they would see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perfected His words, that it's a miraculous thing by itself to see how the rights and the obligations are mentioned, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected people from the evil within their own selves. And this is something that is also mentioned in the surah. So we'll go through some of the verses of Surah An-Nisa inshallah ta'ala, and touching basically on some of the issues that are mentioned. Otherwise, the details of this is to be discussed in its right places. And we listen to beautiful recitation of the Quran, which is one of the objectives of this program, is to listen to the Quran and to listen attentively and to receive the barakah, the blessings, where we listen and we follow inshallah ta'ala. Before we start the recitation, I would like to introduce the reciters with us today. We have Sheikh Ahmad Rajab. Welcome to the program. Barakallahu feek. Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im. Barakallahu feekum. Sheikh As'ad Al-Hawi. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And before we start inshallah ta'ala, get your mushaf, open it and follow with the recitation inshallah. Surah An-Nisa, and we'll go through verses 1 to 5 from the beginning of the surah till ayah number 5. And Sheikh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. وآتوا اليتامى أموالهم ولا تتبدلوا الخبيث بالطيب ولا تأكلوا أموالهم إلى أموالكم إنه كان حوبا كبيرا. وإن خفتم ألا تقسطوا في اليتامى فانكحوا ما طاب لكم من النساء مثنى وثلاث ورباع فإن خفتم ألا تعدلوا فواحدة أو ما ملكت أيمانكم ذلك أدنى ألا تعولوا وآتوا النساء صدقاتهن نحلة فإن طبن لكم عن شيء منه نفسا فكلوه هنيئا مريئا ولا تؤتوا السفهاء أموالكم التي جعل الله لكم قياما وارزقوهم فيها واكسوهم وقولوا لهم قولا معروفا.
Inshallah, barakallah fi, jazakumullah khairan. The surah, as we said, there are some huquq or rights that are being observed because the Arabs and the non-Arabs, before the Prophet ﷺ was sent, they would undermine the rights of women, the rights of those who were weak in the society in general. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way the surah starts with calling the people to fear their Lord and to be dutiful to Him, the one that created you from one soul. So when someone is oppressive towards, for example, women, he needs to remember that both men and women are all from Adam alayhi salam, and Adam alayhi salam is from dust, and this woman that he's oppressing, his mother is a female, and families and people have to observe the rights of one another and not to be greedy. And this is basically when people have power, and the greed and the stubbornness and arrogance, this is all ingredients for all kinds of evil things. So this is in the beginning as a reminder for all mankind, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of both men and women, and He spread them throughout the earth. So repeating the command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fear Allah, and this is a verse that the Prophet ﷺ used to mention a lot in his khutbahs, in his sermon, whenever he would give a talk, to remind the people, all mankind, to be dutiful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be watchful, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is seeing them and He's watching them. Then the verses talks about the rights of the orphans and the times of the Arab and times of Jahiliyyah, when someone will be a guardian over an orphan, and the orphan is the one that lost his father before the age of puberty. So he's in charge of his wealth, in charge of his affairs, especially if the orphan is a female. And whenever she grew up, as Aisha radiallahu anha, she mentioned that if he likes her beauty, if she has money, so he wants to keep her for himself. So he would marry her, and this is basically one of the levels of abuse, without giving her the right dues when it comes to the mahr, to the dowry. And or they would choose for themselves the best of their wealth and would give them the lesser of goodness when it comes to wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade that, and He mentioned that this is injustice, and warning those who are in charge of the orphans to fear Allah and to be dutiful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if someone is afraid that he might not be just towards the orphans when it comes to marrying them, if they like them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted for them to marry up to 4 wives. And this is something that is permissible in the deen of Islam, but with the condition there is justice between all of them. And therefore, if a person is having the fear that he won't be just, then one is sufficient for him. Otherwise, it becomes not permissible for him because of the justice that he has to observe towards all of them. And this is how the Prophet ﷺ was upon, the companions radiallahu anhum were upon, and people would live a goodly life as a result of this. Also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, part of the justice is to make sure that it's an obligation upon men to give al-mahr or the dowry or the rights of the women financially. And if they pardon, if they let go some of the portion that is for them out of their goodwill, then there's no problem in this whatsoever. And this is a general term or principle. When someone has right, he can undermine his own right. He can say, I forgive, you don't have to give it to me now. He can delay it, things of that nature. Also, when it comes to the wealth, since it's the nerve of this life, if it's correct to say, and people are in need of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also forbade the believers from giving their wealth to the foolish ones, the ones that might excessively spending it, whether it's foolishly, not paying attention to what the value of wealth is, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbidding the people from giving their wealth to such individuals, but rather to spend on them, to take care of them, to bring them provisions, food, garments, and things of that nature, and to say all kinds of good and good things towards them or to them. So as you see here, this is introduction to what comes afterwards, and it shows the rights of those who were weak in the society. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the matter very clear that these rights needs to be protected, and to the entire community of the believers to make sure that it's implemented, and those who are in charge and have authority to make sure that they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regards to the wealth and the being of the women, the orphans, the weak among them physically in the society. Then after that we continue with the same set of verses afterwards from verse number 6 to verse number 9. And Sheikh Ayman, please go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وابتلوا اليتامى حتى إذا بلغوا النكاح فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فادفعوا إليهم أموالهم ولا تأكلوها إسرافا وبدارا أن يكبروا ومن كان غنيا فليستعفف ومن كان فقيرا فليأكل بالمعروف فإذا دفعتم إليهم أموالهم فأشهدوا عليهم وكفى بالله حسيبا للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون وللنساء نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون مما قل منه أو كثر نصيبا مفروضا وإذا حضر القسمة أولو القربى واليتامى والمساكين فارزقوهم منه وقولوا لهم قولا معروفا وليخشى الذين لو تركوا من خلفهم ذرية ضعافا خافوا عليهم فليتقوا الله وليقولوا قولا سديدا.
بارك الله فيك. جزاكم الله خيرا. So as you see, the verses are continuing with the same meanings, and to preserve and to guard the wealth of the orphans and to take care of the women in the society. One of which is to test the orphans when they're young. And as we said, the orphans are orphans till the age of puberty. After that, they're not orphans anymore. So if they reach the age of puberty, then test them to make sure that they're not in state of foolishness, where they would ruin and spend all of their wealth in a foolish way. And this is what the verse is mentioned. And the ulama, they talked about this. And if they are having the ability to spend their wealth in the proper way, then to give them their wealth. You were only guardian over their wealth because they were young. Once they reach the age where they're responsible for their actions, then is to be given to them their wealth. And warning the guardians of the orphans not to take the wealth when they're young and to spend it as soon as they can before the orphans becomes old and they're able to take their wealth, which is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the hearts of the people. Because then commanding them and encouraging them, if they have the means and they are rich, then they should not take any of the money of the orphans that are under their protection. But if they are poor, then they should take from it with whatever is known to be good, even for themselves, especially if they're living together. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is all seer of all things. In the times of Jahiliyyah, before the deen of Al-Islam, and it's in any other way of life except in the deen of Al-Islam. When it comes to inheritance, there is so much injustice that is out there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verses with regards to the inheritance that is miraculous in itself, where they used to deprive the women, for example, from inheritance. They used to deprive whoever they choose to deprive. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made clear laws that once a person dies, he either has a will, and the will is only up to 1/3 of one's wealth. He can choose where to give his money. More than that is not permissible for a person, because it's not his money anymore. It's to be given to the heirs and to give this money to them with matters of goodness. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in these, as we heard in these verses, that men, they have their portion, and women, they have their portion of what the people they leave behind, with the laws of inheritance, whether it's parents or relatives, whether it's less or more. This is something that is mafrudan. That means it's an obligation by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for the individuals to decide for themselves. And also mentioning those relatives and the orphans and the poor ones, those who are present in the gathering when they decide for the inheritance to be distributed, to give something to them as a way to soften their hearts and to say something pleasant for them. And then, as we heard the last verse that was recited, if people really fear for their young children, if they die, and this is in the case of everyone has children, he's worried that if he dies, who's going to take care of his children? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishing the hearts of the believers that if you fear for your children, for the being of your children, then be just and be obedient to Allah. Whether it's with regards to the wealth of the orphans, if you're in charge of the orphans, remember that you also have children, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will decree someone for them, if you die earlier, that He would take care of their wealth. And also in general, to fear Allah, to be obedient to Allah, and being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not taking money in an unlawful way, thinking that I'm taking this money unlawfully so that I would take care of my children. No, be in state of contentment that everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of your children, take care of your dependencies, and to say what is just, to make your will in a just way according to the rules from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect you in yourself, in your family, in your offsprings. Then continuing with what's next with regards to the orphans and inheritance, and the next two verses, which is 10 and 11 from Surah An-Nisa, and Sheikh Asad, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الذين يأكلون أموال اليتامى ظلما إنما يأكلون في بطونهم نارا وسيصلون سعيرا يوصيكم الله في أولادكم للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين فإن كن نساء فوق 2 فلهن ثلثا ما ترك، وإن كانت واحدة فلها النصف، ولأبويه لكل واحد منهما السدس مما ترك إن كان له ولد، فإن لم يكن له ولد وورثه أبواه فلأمه الثلث، فإن كان له إخوة فلأمه السدس من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين. آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا، فريضة من الله، إن الله كان عليما حكيما.
MashaAllah, barakallahu feek. These verses with regards to the wealth of the orphans and then the laws of inheritance. And it's miraculous, as we heard. And the wealth of the orphans, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions here in this verse a severe warning for those who take the wealth of the orphan without the right to do so. That basically they are consuming in their own selves, inside of them, fire. And there's punishment for them in their grave after they die, and a punishment in the hereafter. As a result of this transgressing the limits, taking the wealth of the orphans are weak, they cannot defend themselves, they're not aware of what's happening to their wealth. So this is a severe warning for those who do such a thing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا. That means basically there's nothing but fire that they are taken inside of them. Whether they eat by this wealth or not, it doesn't matter, but this refers to what's the norm of the people would do. And anything that grows from suht and from haram, the fire would have the right to take care of that part of one's body that is growing from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade, and they will be punished in the hellfire. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminding the believers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is admonishing you, reminding you, commanding you to take care of your offsprings, of your children. Your job in this life is not just to have children and to leave them like this. You have a responsibility. And that is to take care of them when it comes to matters of religion and also when it comes to wealth. So if someone dies, and this is where the matters of inheritance is not left to the individuals to decide or the government to decide, but it's the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if a person living in a place where the laws of inheritance by the Sharia of Islam is not established, then it's mandatory for them to have a will written in it, all of the different laws of inheritance. And that's why this is a knowledge that is fard, is an obligation for a person to learn or to ask the people of knowledge, because everyone is in need of it, because everybody's going to die. And when a person dies, there are inheritors. And that's why it has to be done in the right way. And when the verse talks about the male will have double of what the female would have when it comes to shares, this is when it comes to the offsprings. So if there is sons and daughters, and they're inheriting from their father, for example, or their mother, their share is to be divided 2-1. And this is by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is by the rules from Allah. And really we don't need to, as some would try to defend, this is something that is in the favor of men versus women. This is really nonsense. Why? Because it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the deen of Islam brings what is perfect and what is just. And when it comes to the financial responsibilities, as we know that the husband or the men, they have the sole responsibility when it comes to the financial being of the women in their life. So when people are married, unlike others, they're not in a partnership when it comes to financial responsibilities. The husband, he is the one that is fully responsible financially over his household, his wife and his children. And if it's a father, then he is responsible fully, right? And if a woman, she earns, and she can earn, she has her own separate financial identity, she can earn it for her own self. She doesn't have to spend anything in the household. If she does it from out of her goodness, this is up to her, but it's not an obligation, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it as an obligation upon the men. But then mentioning here that if a person dies and he left, for example, only females, like a daughter, she would get 1/2 of his wealth. If he has more than one daughter, then they get up to 2/3, as long as there's no others would have inheritance with them. And of course, if you want to learn the laws of inheritance, this is not the proper setting for us to learn all the different possibilities, but this is what the verses are mentioning. And also the inheritance of the parents, the mother and the father, whether it's mentioned here as 1/6 if they have children, and if the deceased did not have male children and only females, then the mother would get 1/6, then the father would get 1/6, and whatever is left after every heir is given their share. This is all is mentioned, and the mother would, in some cases, would get 1/3. And by the way, the mother is a female. So for those who say that the male get double of what the females get, this is not in every case. So in situation like this, the mother will get more than other males inheritors. So this is all by the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the relationship and according to the blood relationship that is related to the deceased. And of course, the rights of the mother is far beyond any rights in one's life. And also the brothers are mentioned with certain conditions, as long as the person does not have offsprings, because if you have sons or daughters, then they deprive, if it's correct to say, deprive the brothers of the deceased from inheritance. But if they would inherit, then the mother would have 1/6, and the brothers and sisters will have accordingly, with the laws of inheritance after it's mentioned. All of these things and more, after a will is being written, and the word will or wasiyah in Islam is different than the inheritance. The will is the choice where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the individual to have a chance to write in his will what he wants some portion of his wealth to be distributed the way that he would like, as long as of course it's permissible. And this is up to 1/3, and 1/3 is too much. So if it's 1/5, for example, of his wealth, he wants to give it to a masjid, to a relative that won't inherit from him by the laws of inheritance, this is a choice or spaciousness for the person to be able to deal with his wealth so that he can get even more rewards after he passes away. And here in this case, also the money that is inherited by the laws of inheritance, a person is getting rewards for it, because this is by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if he earned it from permissible sources. All of that and more is an obligation from Allah. So again, we're not learning here in the setting the laws of inheritance, but to understand that it's not just left to whatever happens or whatever wishes that people have, or anyone writes a will with regards to all of his wealth. No, it's governed by the laws of inheritance that is in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So either people learn it, or they ask the people of knowledge, and you would find most of it, rarely you would find differences of opinions in this matter. So that means follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated upon us. And if a person doesn't have a will, they should have a will to make sure that the wealth of the offsprings and the children and those who are dependencies is not lost as a result of the death of anyone. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-knower, and He is the most wise. And as mentioned, you do not know who's benefiting for you, whether it's your fathers, your sons, so don't think that you know best. Oh, if I die, this will be deprived and this will get, so let me give my wealth to this person or that person. It doesn't work this way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, and who gets what based on the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore leave the matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and put your trust in the creator of the heavens and the earth. We'll stop here inshallah ta'ala because of the time, and we'll continue inshallah ta'ala next time with more of the Quran recited and more benefits to learn, again with the subject of how women are mentioned in the verses of the Quran. Before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for this beautiful recitation, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a source of blessings for each and every one of us, and to give us sincerity in our speech and actions. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم